Pretentious. Pompous. Weird. Inaccessible. Yes, progressive rock is indeed all of these things. I will admit it. You got me. But it's also so much more. It's fun, it's creative, it's imaginative, it can be profound, beautiful. It can also be pretty ugly and heavy and dark. It's dramatic, it's serious, it's quite frankly often campy in a good way, of course. Anyway, whatever it is, it's possibly my single favorite genre, but it's a hard one to actually pin down. So let's talk prog. In this video, I'm going to take you through a brief history of prog, give some popular definitions, and then a few of the problems with that definition, and some fringe cases, as well as tell you about the way I tend to think about prog. So, a brief history of prog. The precise moment that progressive rock started is quite hard to pin down. It developed directly out of 60s pop and rock. Artists like the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, The Who, all of these artists, these musicians and others, all made pop serious. We could almost say that there was a process of seriousification. That's the word I like to use, and yes, I'm aware it's a weird word. Anyway, this process of seriousification throughout the 60s saw pop bands expand their harmonic, lyrical, and tonal palette. So some started to realize the full extent of what could be done in the studio in terms of composition, creating new sounds, arranging more complex songs, like my beloved Beach Boys. Others were more lyrically oriented, changing our expectations and standards for pop and rock lyrics, like Bob Dylan. And of course the Beatles, hallowed be thy name, did both. Now, although I wouldn't quite argue that the Beatles themselves went full prog, they got pretty close, with albums like The White Album, Abbey Road. So did The Who, so did a bunch of others. Anyway, prog, for me, and I think for most people, really starts with King Crimson's debut album, In the Court of the Crimson King. Now, we can split hairs a little bit and say that maybe the Moody Blues were the first prog act, or maybe this band, or that band. The point is that with In the Court of the Crimson King, this is the first album that we can confidently and definitively say this is prog. Long songs, fantasy concepts, philosophical bloviating, lush orchestration, operatic vocals, jazz, classical, folk, blues, rock, all the other influences thrown together into this new sound that completely defied expectations of what popular music was supposed to sound like. So, yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jethro Tull, Genesis, Pink Floyd, these bands all formed or started getting proggy in the years following In the Court of the Crimson King, which was 1969. I think it's fair to say that these are the most famous and successful progressive rock acts of the 1970s, though other major acts of that decade definitely were kind of prog adjacent. Everyone from Elton John, Electric Light Orchestra, David Bowie, and Queen. They were very close to prog, or even full-blown prog at times. The first half of the 1970s was definitely prog's heyday. Jethro Tull, for example, managed to get to #1 in the US and across the world with an album entirely composed of just two 20-minute long plus songs. Whew. And then you got Yes, who managed to get a gold record in the US with Tales from Topographic Oceans, a double album of 4 20-minute long songs. And then you got Mike Oldfield, who saw unprecedented chart success in the early to mid 70s in the UK with a series of huge selling, almost entirely instrumental albums following a very similar format of 20-minute long compositions on each side of a vinyl record. Now, for those of you who aren't already prog fans, this might seem hard to believe. Heck, as a huge prog fan, it's kind of hard for me to believe at times. The music environment today is just very, very different than what it was back in the 70s. Now, in terms of sartorial choices, that might be for the better, but definitely something different. Now, clearly, such success could not be sustained indefinitely, and prog soon came crashing down. Tales from Topographic Oceans may have done well commercially, but it was kind of a bloated mess compared to earlier Yes efforts. And Yes just went through lineup change after lineup change as musician after musician got tired of playing in the band. You got Genesis, who started to move towards pop in the late 70s and definitely into the 80s, where they got most of their commercial success. King Crimson were all over the place and went through lineup change after lineup change faster than Yes, probably. Jethro Tull managed to maintain a pretty steady rate of productivity, but at the cost, in my opinion, of maintaining quality once you get into the kind of late 70s and definitely into the 80s. Their mid to late 70s albums are pretty spotty, and they never really managed to kind of recapture that early 70s magic. Now, Pink Floyd were arguably the biggest exception to this, given that their 1979 album The Wall was absolutely huge. But then once we get into the 80s, that's when we see Roger Waters leave, a change in direction, and a huge drop in quality, again, in my opinion, throughout the 80s. Other acts, some of which I count amongst my favourite, for example, Van de Graaff Generator or Caravan, simply never saw any real level of commercial success throughout the UK or the US. The point is, though, that this first wave of mostly British progressive rock bands burnt bright but burnt short. Progressive rock was never popular with the critics, and by the mid to late 70s, the rise of punk is credited with killing it off entirely. Now, I don't entirely disagree, but I think it's actually a bit more accurate to say that these musicians simply flew a little bit too close to the sun. Once you've made one 20-minute long song, which is around the maximum length of music that one side of vinyl can contain, where do you go? Well, you make a double album of 20-minute long songs, but then where do you go? I don't know. I don't think they did either. But we all know that they definitely couldn't go down this route indefinitely. Subsequent decades have seen their own prog revivals, from Marillion to Dream Theater to Tool to King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. There's been the odd band that's really at the prog or prog-ish flame, but the genre, broadly speaking, has never really managed to reach the same commercial success it saw in 1970s Britain. So, this is the history of prog in brief, but what does it sound like? So, as I've said before, progressive rock really is the next logical step in the process of seriosification of popular music that happened in the 1960s. Live band recordings with 4 or maybe 8-track desks gave way to modular recording techniques and 16-track productions. It was these technological innovations that allowed prog artists to really get imaginative with their songwriting and compositions. That's why we see long, complex songs, forms that go way beyond 12-bar blues or the usual verse-chorus shtick, crazy time signature changes, weird instrumentation from organs, synths to lutes, flutes, and lyres, wacky concepts, extravagant live shows, spectacular studio trickery, basically anything and everything. So the stereotypical prog song is basically a 10-minute long affair with a few guitar solos, at least one synth solo, and more time signature changes than you can shake your drumstick at. Trying to nod your head along with some vintage prog will definitely give you whiplash, but it will all be worth it, trust me. Anyway, there is actually a problem with this definition. In fact, there's a problem with any genre definition, really. So the problem with talking about genres, and not just musical genres, but literary, cinematic, whatever, is that they're not really concrete things with discrete lines between them, but just a sort of vague way of describing families of styles and a way of grouping artists together in a way that makes sense. For example, where is the line between blues rock and blues and hard rock and heavy metal? There is no real answer to that, and that's perfectly okay. Progressive rock, though, is a particularly messy genre, conceptually speaking. So, what do I mean? Well, as a generic label, it's much like psychedelia, art rock, art pop, in that it doesn't really tell you anything about the sort of musical vocabulary that you can expect to hear used. So, to stick to just one example, and we'll stick with psychedelia for a while, if someone tells you that a song is psychedelic, it could be blues based, it could be jazz based, it could be folk based, it could be straightforward sunshine pop stuff, it could be electronic or acoustic, it could be all of them at once, I suppose. Basically, it could be virtually anything. It's one of those things where we know it when we see it or hear it, but it's hard to be much more definitive than that. So it's the same with prog. The sort of musical vocabulary, the licks, the harmony, the chord progressions, the melodic approach, the meters and the rhythms found in one band, say Yes, aren't necessarily likely to show up in a band like Jethro Tull or Caravan. In fact, the musical vocabulary of Yes shares more in common, particularly on an album like Relaya, which is one of my favourites, with jazz fusion bands like Return to Forever or Mahavishnu Orchestra, whereas Jethro Tull are much more roots, blues, and folk based, for the most part. Now, I'm going to do a future episode on genre in depth, but for now, let's just say that there are two types of generic label. So, one of them tells us what sort of musical vocabulary we can expect to hear, and the other one tells us how that vocabulary is used or the context within which it sits. So, genre labels like blues, folk, country, jazz, rock are broader labels that I think fit within that first category, blues is a vocabulary in and of itself. Now, it's not completely distinct from rock. They share a common ancestor, after all, nor is it completely distinct from country or jazz. But just like the German and English languages share elements of grammar and vocabulary, while being distinguishable from one another, the same is true of this type of genre label. I am overgeneralizing just a little bit, but I think the point stands. And then we have the second type of genre label, which is all about the context within which those vocabularies are used. So this includes psychedelia, art pop, I would say reggae, punk probably, new wave, indie, and also progressive rock. So it's important to note here then that progressive rock, though indeed a type of rock, doesn't necessarily employ standard rock vocabulary, harmony, melody, and rhythm. Some progressive rock musicians come from a primarily classical background, others from a jazz background. They tend not to come as much from a blues background, but there is lots of folk, bits of country, and plenty of other stuff. So Pink Floyd are probably the most obvious example of a very blues-based progressive rock band, and they actually demonstrate my point really well. In terms of the musical vocabulary they use, they really are overwhelmingly quite straightforward blues fare. I don't think anyone really would rate them as particularly innovative in terms of their melodies or their chord progression, their broader vocabulary, but the way they recontextualize blues and reinvent it in a totally unique way is just brilliant and undeniably massively innovative and influential. Anyway, so like all genres, people bicker and argue over who is and who is not prog. I don't tend to find these conversations particularly interesting or productive in and of themselves. I'm not here to gatekeep. Honestly, I think we have our own understanding of genres, and that's fine. Nonetheless, I think there are a few interesting fringe cases, and I think the fringeness of them is helpful for our understanding of what prog is. So let's go through a few. So the first example of a fringe case is Queen. Queen certainly started off as a more obviously progressive rock band, but then quickly moved towards more eclectic rock, I guess I might call it. So the high-blown fantasy songs gave way to much more anthemic stadium rockers and a more upfront pop sensibilities. Now, they never lost that sort of progressive rock sophistication, but they're rarely thought of as a full-throated prog band after their first couple of albums, though Bohemian Rhapsody is right on that border. If it isn't prog, it sure is close. And then there's Frank Zappa. Now, Frank Zappa, I think, made Zappa music. In a way, he ticks all the prog boxes, but he comes from a very different cultural context, so it almost feels wrong sometimes to call him prog in the way that we understand it. Zappa feels like its own genre, but it's vaguely in the proggy family, so it's not prog. We also have Kate Bush. Now, I've always thought of Kate Bush as prog, and I think a lot of people agree, but a lot of people also disagree. I found someone on Twitter who was absolutely shocked and a little bit offended that anyone thought of Kate Bush as prog. Weird, but whatever. I do get that most of her songs are shorter than the usual prog fare, and there's little in the way of real, like, virtuoso playing in her music, but neither of those things would make her completely unique amongst prog artists anyway. And then we have the entirety of jazz fusion, but mainly acts like Return to Forever and Mahavishnu Orchestra. So I mentioned these earlier, and lots of people do consider these guys progs, but to me, I'm personally not quite sure. But why not? They tick all the boxes. There's no reason not to call them prog. And I did say I wasn't here to gatekeep. Well, I'm not. But I'll wrap up now and I'll tell you how I tend to think about prog. Okay, so again, I'm definitely not here to gatekeep. So if you think band or act X or Y is or isn't prog, that's totally cool. Ultimately, we're all going to have our own ideas and ways of thinking about what any genre is. To me, though, the secret ingredient of prog really goes beyond playing like really, really complex music that just keeps going on and on. I think that the technical complexity, the virtuosity, the weird time signatures, super long songs, these elements aren't inherently all central to progressive rock, and honestly, not necessarily really what I primarily value. To me, it's more about what those complex elements sit within contextually. To me, it's about eccentricity, creativity, and imagination. Really, it's about concepts, big concepts, whether fantastical worlds or some sort of political or social commentary, or taking influence from some piece of literature and then fitting this into long compositions that eschew the kind of verse-chorus form. These are the things that I personally see as central to progressive rock and what sets it apart from other genres, particularly those like jazz fusion, psychedelia, or art rock, which have a lot in common with it in different ways. Huge part of what we might tentatively call the progressive tendency all that complex and hard to play stuff are really just universal to human nature. So bebop, jazz fusion, gothic architecture, Renaissance, well, everything from the Renaissance, I guess, even professional gaming and athletics, people have always wanted to push boundaries and push their abilities to higher highs. So at the same time that a bunch of nerdy Brits were going all proggy, someone like Stevie Wonder was essentially doing the same thing within the jazz, funk and soul genres on the other side of the Atlantic. Miles Davis was in the middle of a decades-long run of innovation and basically just being an all-round musical badass, but no one really tends to think of these artists as prog. Nor do I really think they should. That's because they had a different project, different aims. There are no Stevie Wonder songs, for example, about being stuck in a musical box and then emerging later having lived an entire lifetime and then aging at a rapidly accelerated pace towards death in front of your childhood friend. Nor do I recall Miles Davis or Return to Forever writing a concept album based on a vision of ecological collapse, and the humans who escape a dystopian Earth to populate the stars, and the conflict that then arises out of these original refugees coming into contact with other humans. Weird. It is precisely this sort of ridiculousness, and I use that word from a place of pure love, that is truly unique to progressive rock. Now, there are some elements of 60s and 70s jazz and jazz fusion that come close to this, but they're usually much more exclusively religious or spiritual in nature, such as John Coltrane, such as John Coltrane's Ohm, and quite frankly, and let's be honest here, they're just not as silly. Now, I actually have loads more to say on the issue, but ultimately I have to stop talking at some point. So for anyone listening who hasn't explored 70s prog rock very much, I would definitely recommend all of the artists that I've mentioned in this video and check out the playlist in the description below. And if there's anyone who's listening or watching, depending where you found this, who is already a big fan of prog, please suggest some underrated albums or bands in the comments or wherever you can find me on social media. So I'll part you with a final thought. Maybe the proggiest thing is simply an artist that denies that they are even prog at all. Robert Fripp, Ian Anderson, Peter Hamill have all rejected the label. I feel like this is a real Monty Python only the true messiah denies his divinity kind of moment. After all, these are amongst three of the most obviously prog musicians ever, and they're saying they're not prog at all, or that prog isn't even a thing. Don't get me wrong, they all have good reasons for resenting the label, they make some really good points when they criticize it, but I'm just tempted to declare a new rule. If someone rejects the label of progressive rock, they are definitely progressive rock. Sorry guys.